Good afternoon, family. Blessings. I share love, peace, and all the good stuff to all of you. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for wanting to learn about this topic and get a bit more versed. And I'm hoping that what I provide today can make your argument stronger, can make your resolve stronger, and our ability to fight for justice in this country. My name is Dennis Febo. I'm the founder and CEO of Guazabara or Warrior Insights, LLC. We're a health and educational services provider whose goal is to raise social consciousness and uplift community. And we do so through the dissemination of our social, cultural, and social conscious education curriculum, which we've been running out of various institutions that are supposed to serve the needs of the people, that are supposed to rehabilitate people in need. So we've been working out of Hudson County Corrections. This is our 10th year. Worked with thousands of our incarcerated community members here in New Jersey. We also work with the juvenile justice system. We have various programs that assist youth who are in touch with the justice system to put a stop to the school to prison pipeline. So out of all the work we've been doing for the past 10 years, we've been able to really integrate ourselves in partnership with various points in our governmental systems. And I, for one, someone who was always, as a young man, rebellious against such system, as I started to get older, realized it's more about people than it is about ideas, right? And government is an idea, society is an idea, it's not a real thing. People make that happen. And when you have the right people in right places, you can make a lot of wonderful things happen, as we've been doing here in New Jersey, and really pushing the conversation, pushing the envelope, moving that needle when it comes to how should our children be treated, especially children of those of us from populations who were either colonized, oppressed, or live in poverty, all right? So we work in conjunction with the courts, we work in conjunction with probation, the prosecutor's office, Office of Public Defender, New Jersey Children's System of Care. We work with various school districts, coaching and doing professional development with staff and social workers to be able to hold these conversations in a very neutral and peaceful manner. And I do so with this workshop that I'm about to do with you guys today. And the premise of this workshop, the Ism of Race, is to give you proper understanding and vocabulary. We're trying to hold a conversation using certain terms. And I know as someone who's spoken all around the country, I go all over the place. And the first thing I'll do, especially in places where we think we might see racism a little more, and I'll go, who here's an American? Raise your hand if you're an American and you're proud of it. And everybody raises their hand. And then I say, if you know what that word means and where it comes from, keep your hand up. The whole room, every single time, the entire room puts their hand down. So it kind of drives me a little crazy because I'm like, what are you talking about that? If you don't understand your reference, your base, your structure, then there's no way that you can hold a proper conversation, right? It's like saying trying to do math and not knowing the numbers, not knowing the symbols, right? So here today, when we talk about the premise of race, a little bit of the history behind it, etymology, right? And the social economic impacts that need serious addressing with a lot of urgency, all right? So I'm gonna share my screen with the PowerPoint. All right, so this workshop I wrote, or this performance for TED Talk. This was in 2016. This session was a TED Talk for TEDx Jersey City. And I've been using it since as a reference base, all right? So I'll start with an anecdote. You know, I work with these young kids. I took them to the movies. When we got there, a lot of our mentors had their youth with them, but because it was dark, we couldn't really tell who was in there. So when the boys came out, some of them saw that they didn't like each other. So they tried to fight in the middle of the movie theater, right? So I'm pushing my kid, get out of here, get your butt in the car. You know, I take you all the way out here to be getting in trouble and catching trouble. Get in the car. He gets in the car. I go, why were you going to fight him? Right? And he goes, because he's from Wilkinson. So here in Jersey City, the different neighborhoods or the different blocks, right? Some of them are at war with each other. So I go, Wilkinson, who's that? He goes, no, it's the people that live on that block. I know, but you called them by the name, Wilkinson. Where did that name come from? Who is that? He said, I don't know. I said, where you from? He said, Curry's Woods. I said, Curry's Woods. Oh, I know the founder of Curry's Woods. That was John Curry. Do you know who that is? Why do you call yourself by that man's name? Why would you want to put your hands on your brother in the name of a man you don't know against him who's claiming the name of another man he doesn't know? And when I asked him, I said, you are only orienting your identity to the block. You live in an infinite universe. From infinity, the block. And when we talk about the importance of identity, it is literally our foundation as a being. Whatever I declare myself to be in this world, there is an unconscious and a subconscious programming that goes along with it. Whereas our habits are created, our ways of orienting how we talk, how we move, how we perform, all of these things are impacted by how we are declared. And in this world, you have two options of declaration. One of them is to declare yourself. The other is to let another declare you. And when the other declares you, they always hold power over you because they retain the power of the definition of the word that you're using to guide your consciousness. So I always tell our kids, the two most important words in the English vocabulary are the words I am, right? And I know it's anecdotal from the Bible, and I don't think it's coincidence that when God was asked, who are you? God responded, I am that I am. So that's to implicate the infiniteness of it all, right? I am, you fill in the blank. I tell the kids, when you walk around saying, I'm stupid, then guess what you're gonna do when someone presents something that requires your intelligence? You're gonna sabotage in order to live into what you've been affirming this entire time, right? So now these, if I said any word, whether it be noun or whether it be adjective, but we're gonna get into the nouns, right? I like to gear our youth and our participants to understand the infinite power of declaration. And that declaration does not have to remain in a noun. It could be an adjective. We actually want that, right? I am love. I am peace. I am success. I am abundance. I am et cetera, et cetera. But when I say I am Puerto Rican, which I am, and I was 18 years old, I go to the Puerto Rican Day Parade. Everyone here seeing how crazy we get in June. All the Puerto Rican flags are covering all of New York City. And I'm 18 years old and I'm waving my flag in the parade. And this lady walks up to me and says, what does that flag that you're holding mean? I said, flag mean? What are you talking about? She said, every flag has a meaning. That flag that you wave so proud, what does it mean? And I didn't know. All of my pride went from 100 to 0 because I understood that I didn't know certain things. Mind you, people died, suffered, bled, spent life in prison over that flag. As a young man, I didn't know. No one in our school taught us. As many Puerto Ricans that were in my classroom, as many social studies courses that I took, I not once learned the truth about my history as a young man. But everyone else sure would love to let me know that I was a Hispanic, that I was a Latino, and now that I am a brown person. I'm only really brown in the summer, so I don't know. I get that part confused. But joking aside, through the power of declaration is how we create these constructs, right? And over the course of our history, there's been key individuals that we've highlighted, maintained, and held the power of such affirmation, right? If I said Christian, most of us could agree that it's the Pope. If I said politics, most of us could agree it's the president. And I could keep going down different areas of our society, and you're going to always find someone that we resided the power in them to be able to absolutely define the social constructs that we live in. Too many of us get it confused, not understanding that all social constructs are tools for social navigation. We have the highest identity that we can identify with, whether you're religious or not. Our laws are born from natural law, the law of God, that you're a child of God, that you're a spiritual being having a human experience. And I say this to our people all the time. You went from spirit to white, you went from spirit to black, you went from spirit to straight hair, from spirit to curly hair. There's such a distance and urgency of understanding between these two constructs that this is why we suffer so much in this country and why we've lost sight of our own humanity and the humanity of others. Because we're quick to want to categorize. We're quick to want to put people in a box and not give them the opportunity to express who they are whenever they feel free to do so. All right? So I always like to get these things straight. You know what? I go to the jail, I give the guys intake forms in, and the ladies, I work with women too, to register into my program. And at the bottom, I put 3 questions. I put, what is your race? What is your ethnicity? And what is your nationality? And then I sit back and I giggle because I know they don't know. I know probably most of us on this call don't know the difference between the 3. But they're super important. Why? Because they exist. We're having conversations on it. We're organizing around it. And I'm going to say this, it is an economic construct. We need to get it very, 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 very clear. It is 10 times more economic than it is social. And having an understanding that it is pushing our identity towards economy. And we're going to get a little more into detail about that later on. Why was race created? Who created it? Because we understand that that was the case. For those of us that identify and associate to race, we're forgetting or ignoring the understanding that your ancestors did not call themselves white, that your ancestors did not call themselves black, that my ancestors didn't go as far as calling themselves Puerto Rican. They had a name. They were called Boricua. This is why we shouted to the top of our lungs in pride, because there's an indigenousness to who we are. I have the right to walk this earth just like everyone else. My family and my lineage was here before most families and lineages were here. So how could I ever feel like an outsider? How could I ever feel unwanted, like I don't belong? The only way I can feel like that is when I don't know the truth about my history. Because when I understood that it was Puerto Ricans that helped free Mobile, Alabama, and Jackson, Mississippi, and in Florida for the American Revolution, it gave me a little bit more, like, I belong here. A question of whether I belong or not. If it wasn't for my ancestors, none of this would be here. So it gave me a different stance in my identity. I joked with my college class earlier this morning. When I came from Puerto Rico, I was about 13. I was born in the US, but grew up my childhood in Puerto Rico. I was in my social studies class, and my teacher goes, "You speak with an accent. Where's your family from?" And I said, "Puerto Rico." She goes, "Oh, so you cut people." Right? And as funny as everybody else thought that was, as a young 13-year-old boy, that impressed me. I actually thought that that's what I was supposed to do. So when I was in high school, I walked with 2 knives in my sleeves because Puerto Ricans cut people. The person that gave me that stereotype wasn't white, she was black. And I walked around with that for years, as a young man and as impressionable as I was. As I got older and I started to break free from those constructs, was I able to get rid of these internal dialogues that came from the voices of others. All right. So just to keep it clear and make it easy, because I know you guys could pull up 1,000 different books on race theory, but to keep it simple on vocabulary, race literally is referring to phenotypic biological characteristics. And we place them in order of urgency. Number 1 being your skin color, number 2 being your hair, and number 3 being your eye color. I'm going to say all 3 are just as arbitrary as us arguing about who has a bigger pinky toe. But if you want to identify with your pinky toe, that's cool. But if we're going to continue to all create a structure based around identifying about our toes, which is just as arbitrary, part of the body, right? Then how are we going to end up having the proper conversations needed to move our humanity forward? Because I'm going to say it like this. The conversation of race was introduced to remove humanity. When you're Black, you're not human anymore. Is this why Black people's rights are violated so much? Is this why we're making a constant plea to say that lives matter? Right? And as we continue to move down the line, for those of us that have power in our definition versus those of us who don't. I hate getting into identity politics. I know plenty of beautiful white people. I know plenty of poor white people who ain't got nothing to do with none of this. They're suffering just as much as we suffering. So I don't get it twisted. On top of that, I've learned from all the leaders that came before, all the elders that came before, especially the ones that were assassinated, the moment they moved their language from race to class. Dr. King, Malcolm X, Fred Hampton, Lumumba, Castro, they couldn't get out, but all of them were literally arguing on economics. It was class, never color. And this is where the fist came from. All power to the people. All 5 races coming together formed the fist. Racial unity was the call. We have racial unity calls since the founding of Texas, which is why the flag of Texas has a white stripe and a red stripe. White and red unity against both DC and Mexico City. But we don't talk about those things. We can leave them completely out of the conversation, the same way we love to put out the story of American history and never include how many indigenous and African descended people contributed to the writing of the Articles of Confederation, the mapping out of DC, the establishment of the 3 branches of government. What we call democracy came from them. It is already acknowledged in our Constitution. So we tell the story, and I know, and a lot of you guys came up in the school districts, they didn't talk about King Tamanin. They didn't say that George Washington stopped the Revolutionary War to honor the king of the Indians. Why was that man so important? And why wasn't he included in our storybooks? Because this starts to give it a whole different perspective. And we need to keep it in one line that some can identify with having and the others can identify with not. And if you want to know how far back this goes, look up Bacon's Rebellion. 1600s. This is how far back the conversation goes, right? So race deals with phenotypic. Ethnic deals with cultural norms. Mind you, the root word or the etymology of ethnic is heathen. Heathen. When I go buy my oil and my adobo to cook my chicken, I have to go to the heathen aisle in the supermarket. From ethnic as culture, racial as biological, physiological, phenotypic, and then we have nationality, which is political. And out of the 3, the one that has the most weight is your nationality. Why? Because it's where we get our human rights from. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written by or extended by the United Nations. You must be of a nationality. You must be represented at the table. You must be able to hold a vote. And if we look at the relationships between the entities and the countries that can have a vote versus those that don't, including the island of Puerto Rico. Passed down what we call the Declaration of Human Rights. That is where we get our humanity. So when I ask a Black person, what is your nationality? And they say to me, African American. The next question is, where is the nation of Africa America? When I ask our brown brothers and sisters, what is your nationality? And they tell me Hispanic, I have to say, where is the nation of Hispania? And because so many of us are walking around not being able to codify ourselves properly in law, any other institution can come and violate your rights because you're not represented at the table. All right. So race, ethnicity, nationality, all right? Then we have what's called the ism. The ism as a practice, a system, a philosophy, a school of thought, right? A practice, a system. So now if I said race as color of skin, the ism as the science of race, and the ist, I-S-T, the ist as the practitioner. The same way a biologist is a practitioner of biology, a racist is a practitioner of the philosophies of race. A racist, therefore, is someone who wholeheartedly believes that they belong to a racial categorization. Why? Because those categorizations didn't come out of thin air. They're not part of natural law. They were created by these gentlemen right here, Christoph Meiners, Johann Blumenbach. There's plenty of studies showing in the year 1776, these men were publishing studies using phrenology, right? The shape of your skull to determine behavior, intelligence, ability to procreate, how sensitive they were to art and music, how lazy or hardworking they were, and deemed any color or melanization in the body as a deterioration of the body according to its environment and behavior. So what he argued, specifically Blumenbach, was that Black people were basically white people who were corrupted, right? So their skin turned Black. But he said, if you work hard enough, you can be white again. So this man invented this philosophy. Then he invented the 5 categorizations, which I got, did I pull them up on here? I'm gonna because I don't have it. Give me a second. I gotta show y'all this image, sorry. I'll find it. So basically he did it by categorizations, and we have 5 of them, right? Caucasians for white, Mongolians for yellow, white then yellow, right? Malays for brown, or Americans for red, and Ethiopians for Black. 5 categorizations. This is where we get the 5 fingers from, and the 5 races: brown, Black, yellow, white, and red. The first definition entry for American: understanding that America, and I do this all the time, I say it in my class, so you don't know what American means, tell me where America is. And people say, in North America. So you're telling me America is in the north of itself? And I'm saying this on purpose because I want everyone on this call to recognize it for yourself. You've oriented the identity and the definition to the 50 continental states, but we'll visit South America? And we won't call them American? A Colombian, a Venezuelan, a Guyanese, a Peruvian, an Argentinian, a Brazilian, they're American. And in law, American nationals, because we come from the Western Hemisphere. So as an American from North America, Greenland and Alaska, all the way south to Tierra del Fuego in Argentina, all of that is the Americas. But if credit is given to discoverers of land and water, then how come y'all are all not Colombians? We celebrate Christopher Columbus's holiday every October, but none of us will walk around and call ourselves a Colombian. So if Columbus discovered America and we celebrate the federal holiday every year, yet we won't associate to a Colombian identity, we associate to the American one. Here again, a bunch of grown people walking around calling themselves by the names of other grown people. As a man with pride in my heart, there's no way I'm walking around really believing that my name is related to this man and I don't even know who he is. I joke around, what if his breath stank? Or he had flatulence problems? You still gonna call yourself by his name? Right? So having an understanding that the name America came from Amerigo Vespucci, who was a cartographer, right? Who discovered that Christopher Columbus did not discover a new route to India. Christopher Columbus died believing he was in India. Mind you, fast forward up until today, we call Native American people Indians. by the mistake that Christopher Columbus made. You go to Washington, D.C. right now, and they have the National Museum of Indian History. I walked into the front desk and I said, I don't see anything from India in this museum. And the lady says to me, well, no, you know, Native Americans call themselves Indians too. I said, yeah, because they made a mistake. But you, as an actual historic institution being funded by the government of the United States, will go up there and put a false name to those people. Because if I put a room full of Indian people from India and Native Americans, and I ask where my Indians at, we're gonna have a lot of confusion. There's power in your name, all right? So, oh, this was the slide on American Indians, right? We call them Indians because of people from India, all right? So we also have the Asian. When I really started studying this construct, right, we understand that 2/3 of the world's population are Asian. 2/3. That's a lot of people. And when I look at the construct of Asia, most of us, and I caught my college classroom this morning, I said, would you all consider, when you drive down India Square in Jersey City, would you say, oh, look at all these beautiful Asian people? You wouldn't say that. If you saw Sri Lankans, if you saw Afghanistanis, if you saw Iraqi people in a community, you wouldn't walk around and say, oh, look at the 8 beautiful Asian people over there. When you think Asian, you think slanted eyes. And that is absolutely racist. It is part of racist programming because people from Iraq don't necessarily have slanted eyes, but they're Asian. And as 2/3 of the world's population, I think it's pretty, what's the word, arbitrary of an identity. It's way too many nationalities in that one racial construct for the Asian race to be a real thing. It's not real. It's called Asia because of Asua, because of when Alexander the Great kept conquering East, he kept calling it Asia until he got to China. Fast forward today, Chinese people introduce themselves as Asian people, but Asia really means Western Turkey. You have nothing to do with Turkey. You're from China. But I'm Asian. And we're going to organize all of our Asian people, but you sure as well including Indian people and Afghani people and Iraqi people in your mind in that conversation. All right. Then we move to the Caucasian. And I love it because people don't really put those two together, right? The Caucasian. You ain't an Asian, you're a Caucasian, right? And as a Caucasian, I ask all white people who consider themselves to be Caucasian, do you know for sure your family came from those mountains? Do you know that there are people living and breathing right now in those mountains that call themselves Caucasians? The same way we're New Yorkers. So how do you know for sure that is your racial category? If you've done a DNA test and you could go far back to say that your family comes from the countries of Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, or Turkey, then you could call yourself a Caucasian. Mind you, there are people of melanated skin in those countries, which means Caucasian does not mean white. And if you want to look up that definition in Black's Law Dictionary, what a free white person is, that had never had anything to do with color of skin, ever. Again, skin color as an economic situation. The only reason Black and brown people mattered in this economy is because Black and brown people were the only people that could stand in the sun all day. White people cannot stand in the sun all day. White people suffer from high incidences of skin cancer. Your skin is not equipped to handle long periods of sun. Black people, they are equipped to handle long periods of sun. If you move a Black person into low areas of sun, their health will go down. Their vitamin D will go down. Testosterone will go down. Immune system will go down. Skin color is the body's ability to adapt to the environment. It has nothing to do with your humanity. It has nothing to do with your identity. It has all to do with your relationship to that beautiful star that God created up in the sky that we call the sun. And for us to have diluted who we are, to that relationship is absolutely false. All right. Caucasian. The other word we say is Anglo-Saxons. As Anglicans and as Saxons, you should be able to prove that that's where your family came from. And I also want to remind you, white people and white skin are only 6,000 years old in human history. Light skin only makes up less than 10% of the world's population. And white genes began in Africa, not in Europe. White people began in Africa. European people were of dark skin. Look up the original Britons. Look up the original Irish. But when we don't tell the story the way that it is, your nationality as an Irish person might have got crossed with the construct of being white. One thing had nothing to do with the other. But now imagine that as an Irish person, you learn, wow, we did have Black in our history. End of racism. You couldn't walk around really believing that anymore. And I tell white people all the time, if you get it confused, then all you got to do is remember that your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother was a Black woman. Every single one of us. So whether you are genetically, or we want to talk about human beings being species, just like Blumenbach did, is what removes us from our humanity. African American. American, again, coming from Amerigo Vespucci. African, coming from this gentleman. So now there's debate as to whether that was the family name or the name was acquired through their conquering of the Afri tribe in North Africa on behalf of the Romans. But everybody here knows, if you know history, the Romans tried very, very hard to conquer North Africa. They had a gentleman named Hannibal, who was one of the greatest generals in military history, in world history. And it was finally the Romans when they beat in the Battle of Carthage, right? If anybody saw the movie Gladiator, they reenact the scene, right? It was this thing that they were so proud of. They finally beat the North Africans and continued to call the land Africa the same way Alexander the Great kept calling it Asia as far as they could reach, even though the original name on the map was Ethiopia. But now we had African from Scipio Africanus. So an African American, when referencing their identity, call themselves by the names of two white men, Scipio Africanus and Amerigo Vespucci. What does that have to do with their identity? Right? Understanding as well that African does not mean Black. If anybody has traveled to North Africa, you know what I'm talking about. If anybody has been to any other parts of Africa, yes, there are a lot of dark-skinned people, but there are also light-skinned people. African does not mean Black. All right. Then we have Hispanic. I like to divide it like that, Hispanic, right? So Hispanic comes from the term Hispania, which is Latin for Spain and Portugal at the time. So I, as a person of mixed descent, because I am Boricua and I'm Puerto Rican, and I have both, I have indigenous, I have African, and I have European through my bloodstream. As a person of mixed descent, why would I box everything that my ancestors are into Spain? When I declare my Hispanity, I am officially ignoring my indigenous and African ancestry. Right? And by doing so, I am orienting my highest vision of who I am as a person and my family and my community to the constructs of colonization. I understand that I'm beyond that. Hispanic was a coined term made up by the US Census Bureau. And I don't know if you guys knew, the US Census Bureau racial categorizations and questions was born from the eugenicist movement. The eugenicist movement was the movement that was trying to get rid of undesirables in our society. That included anybody that was Mexican, Black, disabled, gay, would look different, look funny, or dress different. And they propagated the racial questions throughout the school districts in order to create a mass database to figure out what they were going to do with the population. Fast forward 1920, the US Census releases their race questions with categorizations such as quadroon and octoroon. Racial categorizations that went as far as measuring whether your great-grandparent, one of them, was Black. Because we had laws around different states in this country called one-drop rule, that if you happen to have one drop of Black blood, you were considered Black. All right. But as for Hispanic, I personally do not like the categorization. Number one, because it only includes Spanish-speaking people in Latin America. Latin America has English-speaking, Creole, Patois, Indigenous. If I go to the country of Ecuador, where more than half of the population speak Quechua and not Spanish, and I walk up to one of them on the street and I say, "What's up, my Hispanic brother or sister?" They're gonna look at me like I'm crazy. They don't understand the language that I speak, and they've lived there for thousands of years. Are they Hispanics? It has nothing to do with who we are. Nothing at all. And this is why there's such a debate and why we've been contesting so much the difference between Hispanic and now what we call Latinx. But I also don't like Latinx. I'm just giving y'all my personal feeling on this one as a quote unquote brown person. Latinx comes from mythology. There was a god called Latinus, and the land was called Latium or Latina, which you see here on the map, which were the predecessors. The Latins were the predecessors to the foundation of the city of Rome. The Latins were an actual people who existed in world history, who made a name for themselves in history. Why am I calling myself by the name of a people halfway across the world that most of us didn't even know existed? Why is that my identity? Now I understand it again as an instrument and as a tool. So if I need to wield it, I will. But I'm not gonna walk around confused, really believing deep down inside that I'm a Latino or that I'm a Hispanic. All right. I have another presentation on it because I have more on there. So I have like a bunch of versions of this presentation. There's some slides that I really want to show you guys if I can find it real quick. So I'm just gonna keep pushing along. Caucasians come from the Caucasus Mountains. Indian people come from India. Native Americans don't exist. They have names. There's no such thing as a Native Amerigo Vespucci. They called Haudenosaunee, say their name. They're called Lenni Lenape, say their name. We done killed them all, named our states after them, named our towns, our streets, our cities after them, but we don't bother to really say their name when they're in front of us. We don't bother. So when we start the things that we start in our communities, when we organize to acknowledge that this is their land, still until today. It does something different in my psyche when I acknowledge that when I'm in the state of New Jersey, I don't have to follow colonial standards of identity, that I can acknowledge that this is Lenni Lenape land. And in my mind, it does something for me. In my spirit, in my body, it reverberates differently. I walk more comfortable. I don't have to walk around using the standard of another. That standard was already here. All right. So saying all that with the different categorizations, right? People say, well, then, you know, we've just advanced so far and we've used race for so long that it's almost impossible to separate, as I'm going to pardon my French, call bullshit. We have power. We have power. You always have it. Every moment in time is the ability to affirm and declare. Every moment in time. And if I'm sitting in a room and there's 100 people who are screaming in my face, you need to abide by the racial constructs, I still have the power to say, no, I don't. I don't care what you say. I don't care what degree you have. I don't care who blessed you. I define who I am. And if I say I am not going to abide by racial constructs, then guess what? I don't have to. Doesn't mean I'm ignoring that it exists. It doesn't mean that I'm ignoring the constructs of racism. I just have a separation in my mind and in my heart from the construct and who I am. Again, using it and wielding it as a tool. All right. So I don't know if anybody has ever read Malcolm Gladwell's the book Blink. It speaks heavily on, I'm going to stop sharing, speaks more heavily on subconscious thought, right? And most people don't recognize that the word identity, when you break it apart, is the id and the entity, right? And in the id, in psychology, Psych 101, Freudian concept, we're speaking about unconscious behavior. And it's very easy to program things into our subconscious, let them float on their own, and fast forward till today, you know what we call that? Implicit racism. Implicit, you know what that means? Implicit racism means that you're not a grown person who's sound of mind that could control their own thought process. An implicit racist is basically a person who's coming up with an excuse to be racist. Whether you're doing it consciously or unconsciously, you're still responsible. So we're not going to fluffy it around, right? Having an understanding that I can acknowledge you first, then your race. I don't have to say, I could say this man or this woman. I don't have to say this black man or this white woman. But this is how we speak. And we've ingrained it so deeply into who we are and into how we discuss these things that now all of a sudden we're trying to use master's blocks to build our own castle. We'll never attain racial justice. I'm going to say it again. We will never attain racial justice because the concept of race inherently was stratified, was codified in law. In law. Donald Trump gets to stand up and say, this isn't Black History Month, it's African American History Month, and everyone followed along. Other people get to define that, especially people who ain't from that community, get up and define them, and everyone just follows. The power of declaration. So, identity, Malcolm Gladwell, Blink. In there, they did a study, right? He cites a study. 100 African Americans, 100 Black people. Half of the group, they all had the same academic qualifications. Half of the group, they gave them a test. They all scored an average score, right? Around the same score. The other half of the group, they put a questionnaire on top of the test. And the questionnaire read, are you Black, yes or no? And the group that circled yes scored 50% lower. That's a drastic number. 50% lower than their counterparts with the same academic credentials because they were merely confronted with the question of their Blackness. What happened here? I gave a presentation at Dr. Lena Edwards Charter School here in Jersey City, Black History Month. I'm having most of the kids are Black and brown. I have them stand up and I say, yell at the top of your lungs, my skin is beautiful. They're like, my skin is beautiful. And I want you to yell, my hair is beautiful. And they're like, my hair is beautiful. Now turn to your partner, to one to the side and say, your skin is beautiful. Your hair is beautiful. And they all did it and all the energy was nice and high and love, hugs and kisses. And then I go, when you hear the word Black, what comes to your mind? And this beautiful little 5-year-old Black princess stood up, little quiet, real shy. She stands up, they give her the mic and she goes, slavery? I was broken when I heard that. I was broken when I heard that. This beautiful little girl is gonna grow up if no one stops her, believing that her ancestors were just slaves. And you think as a young girl like that, as she continued to develop to become a full-grown woman without anyone correcting that subconscious thought, that she wouldn't happen to live in to slave-like behavior? So we're gonna argue the same thing with everything else we argue. Because when I heard that, I said, okay, same thing could have happened with me as being a Puerto Rican. My mother had me at 16 years old. My father was 17. My father was addicted to drugs his whole life. He committed suicide in 2008. He abandoned me and my mom and our brothers and sisters. Came back into the picture later on in my life. But I had to go through all of that. As a young man, it really messed me up. I was very angry as a young man. And I was very angry with my father, right? And when I got to college, and one of my most impactful professors started going down the statistics of Puerto Rican men in the United States, that 75% of Puerto Rican men my father's age were dead, in jail, or on drugs. And when I learned that, it was like explosion, right? Because I'm like, well, so it wasn't really his fault. Yeah, some of it was his fault. He made decisions. But we're going to say the same thing for all of our brothers and sisters in the 70s and 80s that were hit with the crack and heroin epidemics. My father was one of them. I had to grow up with all of the generational trauma. Not only that, have 5 kids of my own, and then figure out, how do I filter this stuff that it doesn't cross over into them? How do I break generational cycles? And we understand this through education. We know that. That's a given. But then education so much as economy, right? And I'm gonna move the conversation towards this because you guys will see very soon that New York has a bill now itself, all right? What I'm talking about here is an economic institution called slavery, all right? I think it's funny because we've done a lot to push the envelope on this conversation, including the concept of reparations. Most of us walk around, and I'm gonna tell you, I'm gonna go like about 5 minutes into this because it's also very frustrating for me, so I'm also venting, that when you read the US Constitution and the law of the land, and it starts to really outline who we are as a people, 13 sentences in, 13th Amendment states, slavery and involuntary servitude are illegal, except as punishment for a crime where a party shall have been duly convicted in the United States and all of its territories. And this past year, President Biden declared Juneteenth a federal holiday. We all hit the streets in celebration. Juneteenth, the celebration of the end of slavery. I'm gonna say the 13th Amendment again. Slavery and involuntary servitude are illegal, except. Did we skip over that in class? Nobody stopped and said, there's an exception in there. We're the only country in the world with a written exception and legalized constitutional slavery. What do I mean by that? Except as punishment for a crime. We are the most massively incarcerated country in the world. We are 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's incarcerated. Our prison system surpasses the gross domestic product of 143 nations in the world. You can go right now on your phone and buy stock. Where did the word stock come from? How was Wall Street founded? You think these terms came out of nowhere? You can buy stock in the prison system. So how does the prison system make money? Through human bodies, per bed, per day, over the course of time. If I'm the warden of a jail and there's 100 people in my building, and I know they're all serving 10 years, I can do the math and calculate how much money this is gonna bring in to this county. When we look at somewhere like New York City, such a densely populated city, and Rikers Island, which we have all been begging to please shut down, because it's the epitome of violation of human rights in this country. But we'll sure house a body in there. We will sure mistreat a body in there. We will remove their humanity and we will propertize them in law, which is why when inmates wear jumpsuits, it says property of on the back. You are no longer a human being in law. You are property. You are a ward. You become bonded, insured, the same way our ancestors who were slaves were bonded and insured as well by companies like Wells Fargo and M&T Bank, who are still in business today, who made their business off of the bonding and the insuring of the bodies of our ancestors. Nothing changed. There's just as many Black men behind walls than we had during the peak of slavery. There's just as much money being made off of Black and brown bodies than there was during slavery, if not more. 2.5 million individuals in this country. Our babies being locked up by the dozens in every of the cities that we're in, with no available services or rehabilitation for them. In New Jersey, we spend $430,000 per youth to incarcerate them, but we spend $30,000 to keep them in school. The school that I send my kids to has a 6% math proficiency rate. Would you send your kids there? None of us would. Why would I send my kid there? They're gonna fail. But that's the only school available. Then we tell these young men, pull yourself up by the bootstrap, young man. Make sure you do the right thing. Where? When? What? Anybody been in these cities? Is this a readily available job? Oh, I can live off of this. I'm gonna pay my rent with this job. And if we happen to live in one of the wealthiest countries in the world, we spend enough money to go into outer space that could cure world poverty. There's no excuse. Poverty is a design. Money off of the body has been a design since the beginning of time. Vermont yesterday just had their public hearing to abolish slavery in Vermont. Vermont was the first state in the Union to incorporate the exception clause, 1777. Juneteenth and the Emancipation Proclamation have nothing to do with one another. The Emancipation Proclamation legalized slavery in 5 states. So for us to walk around misinformed, then misinforming others and then have the nerve to celebrate the day that slavery ended, knowing that there's an exception, knowing that there's an effort to end slavery in the United States, and that this construct is still as race-based as any other construct that exists in this country. 67% of those incarcerated are Black and brown men, but only make up less than 23% of the population. But I'm gonna show you guys something else. I'm pulling up census data real quick. Share my screen. This is from the census.gov on race and Hispanic origin. Why did I say that we wouldn't have racial justice? Because Hispanic is not a race. Brown, as far as I'm concerned, were considered Southeast Asians. But now all of a sudden, it means for Spanish descendant or Spanish speaking people. But if the census is making a distinction between race and Hispanic origin, and the census is also collected to disseminate economic structure using these questions, right? Then let's put this together. White alone percent, 76. So the US Census is saying that 76% of the US population is white. Does that sound correct to you guys? For anybody that travels the continental United States of America, every 3 out of 4 people you meet are white. When I saw this, I was like, no. I drove to Florida last year. I didn't see one white. I was kind of surprised. Virginia, North Carolina, we stopped every state down the line. I saw Mexicans, I saw Black people. I didn't see no white people. And I'm like, 3 out of 4. All right, let's keep moving. Black or African American alone percent, 13. So now we're at 89%. American Indian, Alaska Native, 1.3. Asian alone, 5.9. Native Hawaiian, 0.2. 2 or more races, which I think is hilarious, right? Because we've already established there's no such thing as race, right? So how could you have 2 of nothing? How could someone be biracial if neither one means anything, right? And then we have Hispanic or Latino, 18.5%. Do the math, family. 76, 13, 18.5. We're already over 100%. So wait, and at the end it says, white alone, not Hispanic or Latino. 60.1%. So what does this mean? If up here it says white alone, 76, white alone, not Hispanic, 60, there's 16% missing. Where did that 16% come from? Roll of the drum. Hispanic. Hispanic people that are checking that they're white on the census after they were asked if they were Hispanic. Why would the census do that? Mind you, if I grab, I always say the census people, I feel like are these little gremlins in a machine, right? They're like, they think Wizard of Oz, they think everything's funny, and they do this for a joke. Who said for them to do that? That we're going to separate one group based on tongue, and we're going to separate the other group based on color. Now, mind y'all, family, I'm going to go even further on how ridiculously dumb the US Census is. Ready? I guess me angry just showing it. Question number 1. Oh no, this one's like, oh, here we go. Is this person of Hispanic or Latino or Spanish origin? No, not of Hispanic origin. Yes, Mexican, Mexican American. Yes, Puerto Rican. Yes, Cuban. Yes to all the other ones. Please print that in. Question number 2. This is not a good example. Let me get a better one. Question number 2, what is person number 1's race? Mark X on one or more boxes. Again, race, color of skin, hair, eyes, phenotypic. White, black, American Indian, and then look at the rest of the categories. Asian Indian, Chinese, Filipino, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, Guamanian, Guam. The little tiny island of Guam is a race? Samoa is a race? Vietnamese are a race? Puerto Rican and Cuban are not? Wait a minute. We're going to have conversations on racial equality, racial equity, and racial justice, but we're not going to address the people who are creating the categorizations, who are not just creating them, but aligning up gazillions of dollars behind the constructs. The fight for racial justice, step number 1, US Census Bureau. We could talk. Anything else doesn't matter. If the money lines up behind the construct, we have no power. If you really want to declare a world that has the equity that we need in it, it can't be based on race. It can only be based on humanity. Only. There is a whole document based on it. Millions and millions and millions of people died over the course of world wars so this document would exist, so that you can claim your humanity. But we're color. So saying all of this and knowing all of this and knowing how it impacted as a young man and having to grow up in a world and be aware of these things and be myself in a category that's not included in the racial conversation. Do you know how confusing it is for me? Am I black? Am I white? Am I Asian? Am I Native American? You know what I do on the census? I check all the boxes. I did my DNA. I literally have the whole world in my body. And I love that. I love that more than anything. I am of the world. As much as I love my beautiful little island of Puerto Rico, I am more than that. And so is my family. And so is yours. Right? So how do we orient our identities that stand in proper place in law? The United States has the United Nations in it, but the United States is not part of the United Nations. The United States government is not going to open the channel, even though it is international law. If anybody wants to read up on it, right? Look up CERD, the Committee to Eradicate Racial Discrimination. It is a treaty. UN treaties surpass the US Constitution. The United States signed that treaty, but there is not one individual in place who is making sure that jurisprudence through human rights exists at the local court level for us, quote unquote, Americans. Meaning that if I knew Jersey City PD was beating up Black people for no reason, that I can sue them in court for human rights violations. I don't got to go all the way to Spain to do it. But we don't have that in this country. We could sue through the civil rights side, but civil rights only apply to civilians, to citizens of this country. The slave system in this country is super funded through the appropriation and the warehousing of Mexican and Central American bodies. They funded the entire Trump campaign. Trump gets into office, and what's the first thing that he does? He pulls out a CERD. Because they knew what they were going to do at the border. They knew they were about to violate human rights. But if nobody could hold them accountable, they got away with it. We argue things like, during the peak of slavery, they would take families and they put them on stages and they'd separate the kids from the mother and the husband from the wife and the elders from the young ones. What are they doing at the border today? They're using them as stock to work fields. If any of us get it confused, go to Angola State Prison in Louisiana, and our brothers are picking cotton right now. Right now, there are brothers picking cotton for free. There are brothers that are picking okra who are defecating in the fields because they don't give them bathroom breaks. With COs on horseback riding around them to make sure that they're picking the cotton. 2022. So I'm saying all of this, and I'm going to narrow it down. State of Louisiana, incarceration capital of the world. We put up the bill to abolish slavery permanently in Louisiana. 9 white Republican senators came out on that floor already knowing what they were going to say, saying things like, if you end slavery, you can't take me to court. I have immunity. If you pass this, this is the most dangerous bill we've seen all year. Number 3, if we end slavery, we have to revisit every conviction ever handed out by the state of Louisiana. Wait, what? Wait, what? Did y'all hear what I just said? Louisiana said that if they ended slavery in their state constitution, they'd have to revisit every single conviction handed out. Huh? Why? Because labor is inherent in a sentence. When I sentence you to 5 years with 85% of your time, that 15% you work down through labor. So what does that mean? That when a judge is sentencing you for your crime, they are also forcing you into labor. And what is slavery? Then forced labor as an economic system. Not an image you saw in a textbook. To see those men get up there and do that, to me was the epitome. I've read a lot. I'm a student. I'm a professor. Like, all I do is read. I've never seen something so racist in my life, ever. In 2021, US history, the most racist thing I ever saw was that. They knew what they were going to say. So when we talk about structural racism, it looks different to me because the people that embed it are proud of it. What are we going to do against that? How could you argue with someone who's convinced of it? How could you convince them to be more humane? Mind you, we introduced a federal bill to abolish the 13th Amendment, repeal and replace it with the 28th Amendment. Department of Justice got involved, and we've been getting opposition from Republicans and from Core Civic and Geo Group, 2 of the biggest private prison industries in the world. As a matter of fact, Geo Group called me, little old me from Brooklyn, New York, to ask me how could they be more human? Grown men. Why did they call me? Because they knew I was going for end of slavery. And if I end slavery in New Jersey, Core Civic and Geo Group are out of business. They could no longer privately warehouse a body for profit. So race, economic structures, identity, subconscious, empowerment, the knowledge of, I learn about European history all day. We learn a lot about it in school, but I want to learn Japanese history. I want to learn any of the history of any of the people I got around me that I love that are not from where I'm from. And if we can embed a culture that learns to appreciate the culture of others, and not just talk, family, I'm also talking action. There's something more about me trying to teach our little beautiful young Black kings and queens about their history than also taking a drum and going, ite wedi wede, ite osuo, ite wedi wede. There's something different. I've done it in the classrooms. The kids go into a trance. Why? Because I'm singing something that's it's transcendental to them. It is encoded in their DNA. No one just ever sang it to them. So we have the ability to not just teach our culture, but allow others to participate in it as well. And when we talk about race and the ism, right? Understanding that while race as a categorization is phenotypic, we do say things like Black culture, we do say things like Spanish culture, but at the end of the day, they are not monolithic cultures. A Black person from Brooklyn, New York is completely different than a Black person from Mobile, Alabama. A Puerto Rican from New York is not the same than a Puerto Rican from Alaska or a Puerto Rican from Puerto Rico. We are not a monolithic entity. We all have our cultural differences and they must all be embraced, all of it, all right? So using this information is how I run our curriculum at the jail. And mind you, if you know how crazy I look, I spent my whole life staying out of that building. And now I voluntarily go inside of it to teach our brothers and sisters. And when I get up and I start asking them, brothers, I'm gonna go around in a circle and I want you to answer me this question with one word. What are you? And they look at me, well, how do we answer that? I don't care, use one word. I don't care what word it is, what are you? And I know whatever word they say is what they're oriented towards. It's their most urgent in their list of identifications, right? And as I go down the line, you'll see that people will say nouns and people will say adjectives. And anyone that says a noun, I go, what does that mean again? Oh, you're Puerto Rican, what does that mean? Well, I don't know that I'm from Puerto Rico. Do me a favor, translate those words to English. And they go, rich, poor? Are you rich? No, I'm not rich. Do you know any rich Puerto Ricans? No, so then who was that port rich to? And if it was rich to someone else, why do you identify with that when we already had a name, all right? And as we teach that, and as I'm teaching it, you can really see people being moved in there. I mean, I've been doing this for 10 years and I'm in there by myself, so it's kind of hard for me to like try to take a snapshot of it. I do have a video on my website if you guys want to see me raising these questions with our people who are behind bars. You can kind of see their responses there as well, but they soak this up. Between knowing who you are, knowing what you are, who you are, when you are, where you are, therefore you will know why you are. And when someone has their why, they're empowered and they're unstoppable, all right? Not just that, as we implement these curriculums working with our kids, that these are things that I wish someone told me when I was a teenager, because it had such an impact on me. For an adult to challenge me to know who I was and what my family really had to go through, and so I could stop blaming them and understand that there were systemic pressures that made it that my family suffered, right? And me having gone through that, it's easier for me to empathize with those who haven't. For those of us who've never struggled or have never been hungry or have never worried about paying rent, the conversation is a little more difficult, because empathy at certain points requires that you may have had some experience with that issue. And if we know that in order to make a more humane society, we really require more empathy, and that means some of us may have to expose ourselves to actual practices, and you will get more from that than actually talking about it, right? And that's the same thing we do with our children, right? We know that if I use 2 pens or to make 1 + 1 = 2, versus me telling the kid 1 + 1 = 2. If you've never been in a position where you can really see what poverty looks like in this world, I highly suggest you go see it. And it's not to be a tourist. You just need to understand the state of humanity. More than half of the world's population lives in extreme poverty, right? And we live in a position in a society where we have so much abundance, we don't know what to do with it, right? And with that advantage, what could we do for the world, truly, right? And I'll leave it with those questions. Again, I'm all over the place because I have so much information in my head. If you want to see this presentation more condensed and more visual, you can go to YouTube and type my name, Dennis Febo, or type the Ism of Race, and you'll see the TED Talk there. I would like to leave open for any questions or any comments or anything that you would like to highlight.
Dennis, this was wonderful, and thank you. And in many ways, we're walking in the same footsteps. And thank you so much for bringing your thoughts and your verve and your enthusiasm and your clarity to us. Very important. And hopefully this will be part of an ongoing connection. Tati, I'm going to need you to handle the Q&A aspect. Are you able to do that for me, please?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank
This
you.
was wonderful, Dennis. Thank you. I was like, mind blown. So if people have a question, if you would like to raise your hand electronically, please feel free to do so. There are also a couple of comments on the chat. If you want to type your question on the chat, we will try to go back and address those. If you're struggling to raise your hand electronically, I'm just going to give you a hint here. If you click on chat, one of the buttons that should appear on the side of the text is raise hand. We have Aaron. Aaron, would you please unmute and ask your question?
Hi, everybody. It's nice to be here. And Dennis, I would just love to say that it was really refreshing hearing you today. I was telling another participant a second ago, like it was so good to hear you, because I'd say the same thing like every day. Like I really feel like we are definitely going through like a global identity crisis. And I think in order for our humanity to really evolve, we really have to come up with a new language and learning how to speak. So as I was listening to you, I was thinking, if you could, like when you're talking to people, like the next time you try to, or try to explain things to people, if there's other words that you could fill in for, like Black people or brown people, or instead just calling them people, or just calling them by their name. You don't have to just call them, identify them like the color of their skin. I'm just saying, or you could say, that man or that person over there with the blue shirt on, or whatever. You have to start, once you get it in your mind and start training your mind how to talk, it just becomes so natural. And it's that it just, I don't know, what I'm saying? It just becomes so easy. And thinking about other things and that would divide people, and no longer exist anymore. It just comes out naturally. They just become people to you. They're not Africans, or they're not white people, or they're not Black people. They're not white. They're just whoever they are. That's Tati, or that's Ellen, or that's Paul, or that's whoever they are. You know what I'm saying? And when you learn to learn their names, you begin to get like a relationship with those people, and what I'm saying, and it becomes, I don't know, it just becomes easier. And I think that's just somewhere where I think we need to like a good jump start for people to evolve.
Thank you so much, Aaron. Do you have a particular question?
No, I just wanted to say that, but I just wanted to say it was just really refreshing. I didn't really have a question. I just want to.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you.
We have Lujara and then Liesel. Go ahead, Lujara.
First of all, Dennis, thank you very much. when you were talking about Blumenbach, you made me laugh because I did a piece on him for Lucy's Children at one time. And the thing that amazed me so much was the fact that he used characteristics of personality to describe people. And it made no sense, but that's what he did. My question, though, is, I guess, well, actually, I don't have a question. I just want to say one more thing. It was when you were talking about the I ams. One of the things, whenever anybody asks me how I am, I always say I'm awesome, because for me, that's how I am, no matter what else is going on. So it's about word choices and how we find the best word choices to elicit the best out of other people. So I just want to say thank you for reminding me that these word choices are really important.
Lisa?
Thank you. I wanted to say it's one of the best talks I've ever heard in my whole life. Just fresh and clear and concise and illuminating. And I wondered if you work alone or you work with larger groups of people. Like if one wanted to get in touch with you and find out, you know, how to help you extend your work. What forms of organization do you use to do your sharing?
Amen. So, you know, out of everything that I've been doing and the way I put this information together, and why I really started going hard on the 13th Amendment had to do a lot with, like, it's almost like when Neo saw the coding in the Matrix, right? I'm a grant writer, so it starts to make you look at the world. Like when I walk into a space like a government building, I like automatically start pricing up everything that's around. Like, oh, they probably got about a good 2-3 million. There's about 10 staff members, right? So it's easy for me to see the way money flows, right? Because I've been doing this for a while. And then working at the jail, and just learning the way that entire system is set up was like, wait, what? Right? So here in New Jersey, they've been doing a lot of consolidating of the justice system because the numbers have gone down. COVID contributed to that a lot. The courts are very slow right now. They're not trying all cases. So what I did was, using the math, I followed it and then pushed on the government. This is how we did it. The government spends millions here in Jersey City to prevent gun violence. I'm using it as an example, right? So the Vice Unit gets all this money to prevent gun violence. They try everything. They call us all the time. Hey, I have a young man here, we need help, man. We'll try and we'll do what we do. So I started working with some of the leaders, and a lot of us like to call them gangs, but we call them power ciphers, right? They're groups of power, and it's all about how power is wielded, right? So what we try to do is help transform cultural codes within those organizations to do the right thing. And we did a push, and we were able to call one individual, one rep from every neighborhood in Jersey City to call a truce, right? And we went to Liberty State Park, and everyone was there. And when it finished, we jumped right back on the government call, and we said, hey, by the way, we didn't spend a dime. We didn't spend a dime, and we made it happen. You guys are spending millions and you couldn't. So for everybody that we save going through the system, I'm going to use the math. If the math was $430,000 per kid, if I tell the system I'll prevent 5 kids from going in, that's $2.5 million. And that's how I use the money to push back. So the government here actually funded our effort, which are called the credible messengers. They do exist in New York City. New York has about 7 to 9 chapters right now. And basically it uses people with lived experience, whether they're ex-incarcerated or ex-gang involved or currently gang involved, but that want to do right for the community and by the community. So we were able to hire a team of 10. We just got a brand new, beautiful office space. We got a brand new 15-passenger van so we could transport the kids around and do trips with them and do fun things. Our staff of mentors, I started by myself. Now we're at 25, right? And this is over the course of the past about 7-8 years that I've been growing these services. Now we just increased our contract at Hudson Corrections where we were providing more services: domestic violence, batterers, emotional literacy, relationship intelligence. We trained the social workers, and we trained the correctional officers on these constructs as well. So that's been like the development
What's
of
it
our
called?
agency. I'm gonna type it in the chat, Guazabara Insights, and I'll put the website as well. Guazabara means warrior in Arawak or Caribbean, like the indigenous of the Caribbean. Warrior Insights, I started it 10 years ago. Last year, we made our 10th year anniversary. And I also have a 501c3 called the Guazabara Foundation, which is doing both community work and taking on some of the educational components of amending the 13th Amendment here in New Jersey. New York is announcing their bill to abolish prison labor very, very, very soon. They already launched their social media campaigns, and apparently already have legislators willing and able to introduce that legislation. New York did not inscribe the 13th Amendment into its own state constitution, just like New Jersey. Therefore, our constitutional campaign amendments or campaigns are based on adding anti-slavery language to the state constitution, i.e. New Jersey would say slavery and involuntary servitude are illegal in New Jersey, period. No except, no punishment for crime, none of that. New York is going on the same route. So New York is a beast. It's too many people. It's such a big state between the state and the city. It's going to require a lot of hands on deck to educate the public. This is a ballot question. The states of Colorado, Nebraska, and Utah have all three abolished slavery. Colorado did it first in 2018. Utah and Nebraska did it in 2020. And Rhode Island was the only state to be the only state to permanently abolish slavery, even though nobody's ever challenged their practices. So for New York, we're going to be doing the work. Like here in Jersey, our bill died. I'm going to attribute it to COVID. We went through both committees. We went through the public hearing. But when it came time for the vote, apparently Governor Murphy did not want that ballot measure on his ballot because he was running again. So they shot the bills down, right? And we're going to start up all over again. So that'll be this year, but so we will be starting up simultaneously with New York, right? So the goals of decarcerating, right? I tell the guys in the jail all the time, do you know where all the money is to fix the problems in our community? And they go, where? Right here in this room. All of your bodies added together will solve the problems going on outside. So when I get them to recognize that and they start participating along, 3 of our credible messengers on our team, they were part of my program in the jail. And I vetted them and coached them until they came home, and now they're doing wonderful things, right? So if you wanted to reach us, you can just go on the website that I put up. I also put my email. And if you need to reach me, you can email me. And I love collaborating. I love plugging people together. I love creating. So if there's anything that you have in mind, or you need assistance, or you want me to plug you with someone, or want to try to get the work going on your end, please feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much, Dennis. We have another, Zoe has her hand up.
Hi, yes, I do. My name is Zoe Yates. I'm a student at Tulane University, so I'm actually in Louisiana right now in New Orleans. So that hit home for sure. I'm actually from Washington State. I'm from Seattle, or like 40 minutes north of Seattle, a small town called Monroe. And there was a Young Gifted and Black conference, and it was about 4 years ago. And the lawyer, she works in DC, she was given a presentation, and to the end of it, this was when I first got into the idea that like slavery is not over, was when she was talking about the prison system and how it's the equivalent of slavery because labor is forced and people are wrongly, convicted for longer trials and everything. And so but then I've, been off for a while. And so my question to you, as far as like, because I've gone through a lot of transition as like a young woman, young person, of finding like identity and like being Black, and then having labels be put on me, then turning around and despite it all, trying to own back the labels so that I can own it myself, so that it's my own and ownership. And then now this presentation really hit home, like, oh my goodness, like it's just a social construct and it's holding power over us. And so my question is, how do we come to terms with, okay, race is not real, or race is made up and it's really just the color of our skin and it's not who we are, and we can't put like characteristics and personalities to a race because it's just not real, like you just said. And so how do I like transition from being, oh well, I'm a person, but like you said, it's still a tool and it's still there. So just because I can come to terms and understand that race is just made up so that people can put us in a box and labels, the world still works on those ideas of race, and they're still putting us in a prison because we are Black. They are still putting us, taking us out of our schools and getting us in trouble and putting us on probation because we are young Black people, or killing us in the streets. And I'm, talking to my Black, there's multiple other minorities. So how do we go from trying to understand that race is not like an identity, while also the entire world and our systems are set up based on putting us into these categories and oppressing us into these categories? Like you said, there's so many people Louisiana has the largest amount of incarceration in the entire world, and most of them are Black people or minorities, and so they are being unproportionately put in there, and a lot of it is because of their color. And so how do we do that? How do we accept the idea that race is not real, but also like fight against the systems that are oppressing us because of our race that they've put onto us? And so I'm just confused how that happens, because like I want to be proud, like I'm a Black woman and I'm being, there's certain things happening because I'm Black, but like Black's not real.
Right. So, I mean, that's a great question. And you're speaking about the paradox that US society is, right? That we can actually have this understanding, but it's like, all right, now that I know this, how do I move around? And we can say the same thing with other identity constructs. The same thing's happening with sexuality. 20 years ago, we wouldn't hear half the things that we're hearing today. And then this new generation is just really pushing the envelope on these constructs, which I really love. But again, all through with guidance. So what I would suggest, like I said, race ain't real, but racism is, right? The ism, the science is real. They created it, right? And it's been in place for centuries. So it's almost, sometimes it feels almost defeatist and impossible to try to consider the world without it. But it's all, I'm gonna say, like, kind of like pick your battles, right? And understanding the war. When you're alone in your house watching TV, you're not Black. Like, you're not thinking about your skin color. When I went to Africa and I was walking around Nigeria, and everyone was Black, right? And I was like, how beautiful is this? Look, there's a world where Black people get to be, and they don't have to worry about being Black. So what does race look like, or racism look like in that situation? Now, do African brothers and sisters oppress each other? Yeah, I saw with my own eyes. Do people of color oppress each other here in the US? Absolutely. Absolutely. The oppressor doesn't have a color, it's a mentality. And whenever oppression shows, it is our responsibility as children of God to fight that, however that looks. If it means associating with the identity, because that's what's going to get the job done, then associate with the identity. If it doesn't mean that, and you don't have to incorporate it, if I want to talk about police brutality, and I tell you I've been molested by cops, I've been jumped by cops, and I've been given false charges by cops. Dominicans, Blacks, and whites, who were the cops? That had nothing to do with skin color. And I'm light skinned, right? So every scenario is going to have its own formula and its own mathematics. You, as the mathematician, having an understanding of the tools is going to allow you to control that environment and those outcomes easier than that we were just succumbing to the identity itself, right? So I would say it's not like kind of like give up the identity and don't ever claim it, or It's not about that. It's more just understanding, yeah, I get to be Puerto Rican, but I'm not Puerto Rican all the time, right? If I was going to choose an urgency of what I was, I would go with spirit. I would go with human. And the reason we don't have that in this country is because we have no avenues for accountability for humanity. The moment we start using human rights jurisprudence on the local court levels, I'm telling you, a lot of these conversations are going to go out the window. When people start getting locked up for this, is when people are going to start taking it seriously. But right now in this country, especially with the Trump era, a lot of people were emboldened, right? And it kind of feels like it's uglier in our face. But I, for one, am one believing that this entire system that we consider is going to crash at some point. I've met way too many babies who are Korean, Japanese, Puerto Rican, Jamaican, Guamanian, and Irish. You know how many kids I've met like that? What race are they? And if we fast forward 100 years from now, race ain't gonna hold the same weight. We're gonna be too mixed to do that, right? So these conversations are temporal. And at this point in time that we exist, we're in the last vestiges of it. That's how I see it. This is why this call exists. This is why you guys come together, because you all feel it. You're moved to try to do something to push the envelope to get rid of this nonsense. Some of y'all, a lot of y'all elders, you've been living it for way too long. You guys saw it when it was at its ugliest. And you have those reference bases. So yes, as the elders, it's your job to help the young ones transition in. The young ones are coming in with all these fresh ideas about who we are. Some of them I agree with, some of them I don't, right? Doesn't mean that they're all gonna be perfect, but what we want these kids to know is they have that freedom. That's empowerment, right? In order to understand, to be empowered, you must understand the truth and the power behind self-declaration, right? Declare yourself. And if Blackness happens to be what you need to declare at that moment in time, then go ahead and do it with all the understanding that goes behind it. Don't just claim it just to just claim it. I tell Christians all the time, what does the word Christ mean? And they go, Jesus? No. What does the word Christ mean, Christian? And they tell me they don't know. You need to go back to the books. Don't walk around claiming your Christianity if you don't know what it means. You've never read the Bible from front to back. You've been a Christian your whole life. You've never read the book that sources it all. So it's not to give up the idea of Christianity, it's to challenge you to become a better Christian by having understanding on the identity. There's too many Christians walking around as Christians, not doing the Christian thing. And we have people who don't consider themselves Christians being more Christian than anybody else I've met in a church. Right? So it's not to get confused with the identity, it's to have all understanding in the practice.
Thank you, Dennis. We have Alicia as well.
Hi, I'm gonna pass because my dog is barking. I'll try to come back.
Feel free to post it on the chat if you'd prefer. We have a question from Diane asking, who's on your shirt?
Oh, so this is Dr. Pedro Albizu Campos, who is known as the father of the Puerto Rican nation, and he fought for Puerto Rican independence in the 1950s, and he was tortured to death by Dr. Cornelius Rhodes using live cancer transfers into his body. He spent countless amount of years behind bars. The United States passed a law called the Smith Act that made it illegal for Puerto Ricans to fly their flag. Till today, if you go to Puerto Rico and you look at government buildings, the law says the Puerto Rican flag must be flown and the US flag must be flown higher than the Puerto Rican flag, anywhere it is flown, till today, right? People were killed for wearing the flag, and we used to wear them on our sleeves. This is why Puerto Ricans are so proud. This is why you see the flag so much. We were prevented from ever showing it, right? So he's one of my heroes. He was a Harvard graduate, a lawyer. He was put into a Black regiment in the Army and the Marines because they thought he was Black. And that's when he first learned about racism in the United States. Used that, went to Puerto Rico to try to fight for Puerto Rico's independence.
Thank you, Dennis. Alicia, do you want to give it a shot now?
Yeah, I'll try. Okay. Hi, Dennis. Thank you for your presentation. Dr. John Henry Clark started the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilization, and he felt that it was imperative for Black people in America and also the world to understand our African origins, to take pride in our African origins, to understand that we had a history before slavery, like you mentioned, the little girl. And, he also encouraged Black people in America to start identifying as African. So can you speak to that? Because on one hand, like I get being human, like Malcolm X said he, was fighting for human rights. Dr. King said he's fighting for human rights. But at the same time, Malcolm X talked about us being Africans. Dr. Clark talked about us being Africans. And I find that empowering to identify myself as an African living in America. So can you speak to that, please?
Yeah, I'm going to say that as long as the terminology holds power, and I'm going to say especially in law, you understand? So Blackness in law versus Africanness in law. Is Africanness represented in law? Absolutely. The African Union is powerful. The African Union is huge. Africa is enormous. There are thousands of cultures in Africa, right? So again, not a monolithic entity or identity. The reason I find friction with some of the terminology is there always has to end up being an individual who has to define what that means, right? And if we wanted to get technical, everyone came from Africa, right? So every human being's African, right? But now if we wanted to lean towards identity or political identity, which is different, not just about like, I'm claiming an identity so that I can feel proud about it. I'm claiming an identity as an instrument and access, right? What instrument does Africanity serve, right? And again, it won't be an instrument until there is a consensus on the identity, right? And what happens with Black people? Negro, Black, African American. What happens with Spanish people? Spanish, Latino, Hispanic. Which one are you? I'm a Hispanic. You're a Latino. You're a Negro. You're a Black. You're an African American. Since there's so many categorizations, one group can't come together and say, like, i.e., I'm Italian. Is Italian represented in law? Absolutely. Does Italian have a pristine history that goes back thousands of years? Absolutely. No one ever challenges it. There's no question, there's no confusion about what an Italian is. Is Italian monolithic? Absolutely not. It has a lot of distinct forms of cultures within the construct of being Italian. But why is it when it comes to Blackness or Africanness, it gets lost, right? Now, again, because we don't really have, and I know, and if you look up on Delaware.gov, the Delaware government website, let me see if I can pull it up real quick so you can see what I'm talking about, calls the Lenni Lenape Moors. Does anybody know who the Moors were?
Yes.
Right, so Moors were, whether we call them the Ottomans or the North Africans or the Southern Europeans, West Africans, there was all kinds of different peoples that existed as Moors. And when you look at, when you start to look at different titles, which I just found it right here for you, just to show and prove, right? Because if I'm an African versus I'm a Moor, what does that mean? What's the difference? Where's the legality behind it, right? So I'm gonna show you right here. Delaware.gov. When you start to look up, right? Mind you, Delaware were the Delaware Indians. Lenape Indian tribe of Delaware. The tribe was formerly known as the Moors, and for many decades of the 20th century, state documents such as driver's license designated the tribe's race with an M for Moor. Wait, what? Lenni Lenape. I'm talking about Native Americans of New Jersey and Delaware and some parts of New York were called Moors, and their documents were designated with an M. When we say who won the Civil War, everyone says the North. The North didn't win the Civil War, the Gullah did. Who were the Gullah Geechee? Who were the most feared warriors in US history? That when in the middle of the US Indian War, the main general said in his writing, I want everyone to know that this is not an Indian war, this is a Negro war. But you're walking around thinking you're African only. Where's your indigenousness to this land? And if my identities remove the continent away, and my identity does not ground me and my feet to this earth with purpose, then my identity does not serve my purpose. Right? So I need you to acknowledge your indigenousness to this land. And I need you to look deep into what that looks like. Right? Because if you don't have that understanding and you're not making those historical connections, then you're just following colonialized forms of history and therefore colonialized identity as an expression.
Thank you. Thank you. Excellent.
We have Pauline. Go ahead, Pauline.
Pauline is on here.
Hey, what's up?
What up, Pauline?
So I have well, first I have a comment and a question. So one of the, in grad school, I did a lot of research on racial identity and indigenous communities on Long Island. And one of the things that I found was that in census, census collectors for many years would categorize the indigenous groups as M for mulatto.
Yes.
And then all of a sudden they started categorizing them as Black. And that's how the indigenous groups on Long Island became Black.
Were lost, right? Or were exterminated. They weren't exterminated. We're still here.
We're
here.
Yeah, we're still here, but we just became Black. So so these government designations create identities for the purpose of creating these hierarchies, or for in some cases seizing land and creating great resort towns for rich white folks. But I digress. So one of the questions that I had in working within a system, and particularly working within a system that deals with youth of color, and trying to look at that system to see decision points where youth are treated differentially based on their imposed racial identity. How would you propose that that examination, happen when from the beginning that these are imposed identities, and these may not be the identities that these youth choose for themselves, yet we know that certain decisions are being made at points at which these social constructs are being placed. And I hope I'm making sense, because I'm trying to ask this question about, and I guess it's similar to the young lady's question about how do you work within a system looking at these inequities, knowing at the same time that these are social constructs that are both systemic and individual, and are transitory over time. Like
they're very, very slippery concepts, right? Because
yeah.
it's like you could try to narrow down into it, and then you'll raise a question where it pokes a hole, and you can never get to like the solid, like what does it really mean? Which is why I say it's hard to talk about racial justice or even get there, because they become circular conversations. We might start talking about Blackness, and then someone goes, but what is Black? And then you got a dark-skinned Dominican who may be darker than a light-skinned Black person from the US.
It does
and the
not consider
light-skinned Black
themselves
person,
Black, right?
exactly, or vice versa. The American person might be like, well, you're not Black, you're Dominican. You don't know what it means to be Black. I'm darker than you. What are you talking about, right? So that's why it gets so like fuzzy, right? And Pauline works with us in the part of the justice system over here in Hudson County. So we have like the DMC committee, right? Disproportionate minority contact, and we try to have these conversations. But if you notice, every time we meet, it just goes in a circle. It just keeps going because we don't have the reference bases, right? Which is what I was trying to challenge. I did also challenge it with the prosecutor's office. They said to me, well, there's no way we know the race because we omit that information when we give the police report.
Right.
And one of the lawyers said to me, they know damn well who Jose Santiago is. They know damn well who Raekwon is, right?
Yeah.
So it's not, the name sometimes gives away the race. And the prosecutor said to me, well, I don't know anyone here that's overtly biased, but I can't speak to implicit, right? And that's what I meant about people using it as an excuse. You know the numbers are wrong. You know that number is the most highly disproportionate number in the entire United States of America, but you want to sit here and say
also
implicit.
racial classifications is so embedded in our society that whether or not you track it, you are categorizing people. You're making a mental note as to which group this kid belongs in. And that's going to dictate their treatment and how you're dealing with that kid. It's just, I find it a tough topic to deal with in this type of work, because I think like we all got to be on the same page and have the same vocabulary and know exactly what we're talking about when we use these terms, and we don't want to have that discussion. And I think that's a necessary discussion to have before anything else happens.
I agree. And if you notice, any population that's ever got reparations and world history, they can all attribute, because the construct of reparation means repair to the pristine state of the people prior to whatever injustice occurred that removed them from such state. Okay, so what was the name of your people before when they were pristine? And everybody goes, right? So if we can't define the group,
they weren't,
then we can't refer to a previous condition that we can call it on, right? Africanism might work because we could talk about African empires, and to the beginning of human civilization, these empires were enormous.
Exactly.
Enormous. And we go over them, skip right over all of that during any of the history courses I did in public school, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes like learning those things, I would say DNA testing, even though it's not 100% accurate of a science, but it can be used as a reference. If I know it's showing up 30% Yoruba in my DNA, I know I could get on a plane, go to Nigeria, and go chill with the Yoruba. And it might not take me one visit, it might take me 10, but I am able to reclaim, as I did when I went over there. When I was in the bodega buying food and I thought I heard bachata on the radio. And the food we ate was rice, beans, plátano, and fried chicken. All the entire trip, right? So it does something completely different when you're able to go see and live it. And one of my goals for here in Hudson County is that when our kids finish our program, we take them to Africa or we take them to South America, because then it gives them that experience base. And I'm telling you, when I lived in Cuba for 4 months and I lived in Brazil for 4 months, but when I came back from Cuba, I had to redo my whole life in my mind. Like, it completely shattered my identity as an American, as being from Brooklyn, as being a Puerto Rican. Just living in another world just really challenges that for you. So that's why as a professor, I'm always pushing, study abroad, get out there, go learn, because the books help, right? Discussions help, but experience does more. And only those of us that can retain information, that are intellectual, that can speak these things, will benefit from discussion. Our young ones who are diagnosed ADD and OCD and oppositional defiant, they don't have enough time to sit down and process what you're trying to say. But if I put a drum in their hand, and they start right, and they're smiling and they're moving, right, now I have something completely different for them than just speaking about it. So that's really our goal this year, is really kick up on arts and engagement and getting them to produce content, to tell their stories, because this is how we'll start changing the narrative. I keep saying, if you want Black people to be reported on, all we have to do is shoot each other. We shoot each other right now, the media will be all over. Ask me how much they've covered Amanda 13th in New Jersey. Once, because we had to beg and we had to sing and dance in order for NJ.com to cover it. Any other time they told us no. So no one else is going to tell the story. But again, I need that identity group, right? I need to bring people together under one construct. The Black identity ain't enough. Jersey City as an identity ain't enough. New Jersey as an identity ain't enough. American as an identity ain't enough. But guess what could be? Human.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Amen.
Thank you so much. We also have Carlos. Carlos, go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Dennis. Thank you, Dennis, so much. I really enjoyed your presentation. I just want to emphasize I'm Puerto Rican, Park Slope for myself. Was in the prison system as a youth, and in the 90s, at the height where New York City was arresting the most youth, more time than any time than New York City's hit, 400-year history. The stuff that I seen inspired me today, like just to be a researcher, scholar, and learn. I was associated with programs like UniCatch when I came out, try to get as much people into college as possible. The identity angle that you're doing right now is so the right angle, the right way. We don't know how to identify with ourselves. That old system that we're given, that science, that way of thinking, that old science is no longer valid. It no longer puts us in sync in our modern times. Our children are being failed. They no longer cultivated or with the system that turns them into adults, or humane adults at that. It's like they're like grown children, and it's really frightening to see at the levels of exploitation occurring, because instead of helping it, it's more like they're being exploited by it. And then it's just like almost happening at a larger scale. Like you said, the prison system is a byproduct of that. And it's frightening to see that sometimes it can be neglected. Some of the dehumanizing right there, right next to us, like the Rikers Island. One of the largest drug spots in New York City at the same time. So, in our society where, a lot of times we focus on the nouns, the states, the lines, the dress, the clothes. We forget that we're verbs, we're four-dimensional beings. We cultivate time. We're creatures of action. We're dynamic. We're never the same creature as we was yesterday. And that's a universal knowledge that's in our stories, our souls. We have a beginning, a birth, and an end, and then we try to cultivate and share ourselves as much as we can. We converge time streams, so to speak, and that we give that to our children for the future, and that's where I think we're failing them. And I applaud you for really reaching out and helping humanity. And I remember one of the main things that we neglect, that in order to save our humanity, we have to save our humanity. That is, and Dennis, bravo. I applaud you again.
Thank you, Emmanuel. I appreciate you.
May I ask another question?
Go ahead, Alicia.
Hello again. I really appreciate your answer. I mean, my brain is just buzzing. You talked about exploring, like, okay, so African, yes, okay, but then you talked about exploring, I guess, the indigenous part of that. Like, honestly, as a Black person in America, I never made a connection with any indigenous connection with this country. But I mean, I know my ancestors were enslaved here, but for me, in my mind, that was okay. They came from Africa and were enslaved in this country. How do I, what can you explain more when you talk about exploring my, indigenous roots?
Yeah, absolutely.
I never thought of that.
Something to consider. A lot of our ancestors came here free. A lot of our ancestors were not slaves. A lot of our ancestors owned land. A lot of our ancestors owned businesses, right? And what did it look like for them, right? So when we, as a lot of us in our consciousness think of Blackness equal to slavery, that's one of the main things you got to break away from first. Not all of us were slaves. Number two, you want to see the guy who showed, I'm going to show you real quick because it's so fun. The guy who discovered land on Christopher Columbus's ship. This brother right here. So since when do we hear of a conquistador looking like this? He was on the ship where Columbus was on. And guess what? The Moors had already been here. How you think Columbus knew how to get here? Why would he have a man on his ship that looks like that? And his name is Juan Garrido, Spanish, right? So Juan Garrido came here as a conquistador. You had John the Moor. I'll show you another one. John the Moor, who explored, he was basically the first explorer. Oh, there's some other guy named John the Moor. Hold on. Right, this is John the Moor. Estevanico was his name. He explored the Pueblo people, Colorado, New Mexico, the whole story behind it, but we don't hear this part of it, right? So Juan, even though he was an indentured servant, because those were economic arrangements compared to slavery, a lot of our ancestors were not that. That's number one. Number two, if African people were here first and showed Columbus how to get here, then think about all of us that have African ancestry in the Americas outside of getting snatched up as a slave from Africa and brought over here. Is that what explains why so many indigenous people were dark skinned? I'll show you another example. The Garifuna, or what we know as the Black Caribs. And if I'm showing you Black Carib pictures from back in the day, look at the color of the indigenous people in this photo. Look at their garb, what they're wearing. Look at the way the Europeans were receiving them. I'll give you another one. George Washington consistently putting himself in photos and in paintings with a Moor in the background. Think about it. Why would they do that? Why would George Washington feel the need to have to add this young man in the back? You want to know why? Because it gave him clout as a man to have a Moor in his picture. It's basically like taking a picture with a famous person. But we don't talk about these things, right? We just skip through it. You see an image of George Washington, you see an image of George Washington and his men. What's this black guy doing here? What is his name? Why is he so important that he's in a photo with George Washington, right? And what was his relationship? He goes another photo, George Washington with a Moor in the background. All right. So I'm saying your point of orientation at the beginning of the story needs to move back. No more the Spanish and the Portuguese or the English got there and picked up your ancestors and brought them here. Stop that story. That's a lie. It's actually 2% of African history. 2%. So if I start to reference the understanding that Africans were here, the Chinese were here, the Vikings were here before Columbus got here. The only reason Columbus knew how to get here was because he had Moors on his ships. And they're the ones that had already sailed to the Americas. They already had treaties and contracts with the Native Americans, which is why the Lenni Lenape, because it's the most easternboard tribe, right, to where Africans were coming, were dark skinned, which is why the Black Caribs were Black Caribs, because you had Africans migrating to the Caribbean, and our ancestors that were indigenous were of dark skin because of that. So what is Africanness then? What is Blackness then? Where does the story start? So another one is Gullah Geechee. Read up a lot. Look, this story is amazing. Who are the Gullah? Right? They still exist till today. They have their own tribes and councils. They're still respected. The Gullah Geechee cultural corridor, right? And the Gullah Geechee were kicking the Confederates' ass. It's literally how the North beat the South. While the South was fighting the North, the Gullah came from behind. And lowered their numbers so much, the Confederates knew that the time was up. But we never sing the praises of the victories of the Gullah and the liberation of themselves. You know what the story of Juneteenth says? That these white men in blue suits showed up and told our ancestors, who were somehow too ignorant to know that there was an entire war where 680,000 people died. No, our ancestors didn't know slavery was over. So men in blue suits showed up and told them and gave them their freedom, and thus we celebrate Juneteenth. Meanwhile, we never learned about the Gullah and what they were doing to fight the most fiercest warriors the US Army had ever seen. What does it mean to get sold down the river? Look that up, right? Look up Black indigenous populations of Florida, Louisiana, Texas, the entire South. Black people and Native people lived side by side for so long, there is no way you don't have indigenous blood in you. And if you know that you have indigenous blood in you, what claim do you have to this land? Are you a foreigner still? Are you someone who was just brought on a ship, or did you always belong here?
Thank you so much, Dennis. We are actually have passed the time for our meeting today. So sadly, we have to bring this to an end. We would love to see everybody back here. We have another program that's coming up that is happening next week. I'm actually just pulling the link for you guys to be able to tell you. Miriam, do you want to tell them a little bit about what it's going to be about?
There is, can you hear me? I think
Yes.
so. There is a general sort of reaction to this a series of concepts, which is called critical race theory. And it's basically a reaction by people who are concerned about, I think, historical exposure. And anyway, the point of the matter is that we're going to explore this. And we have someone coming on Wednesday, Alan Singer, Dr. Singer, who writes for a variety of sources, and that's on our website, and I think it's on the BSEC webpage, will be our guest on Wednesday. I'd like to encourage those of you who are asking these very probing questions. I'd like to just say a word or two before we go. First of all, the road to personal liberation is not a straight road. It is a road of self-learning, of constantly shedding what has been a layered determination of who somebody else thinks you are. This is going to be a lifelong process. All right. And you're going to always be acquiring new information. I would invite you to come and be a part of Lucy's Children as we probe a variety of things. While we don't spend a lot of time talking about the African situation in terms of the prior or pre-colonization process and the pre-slavery process it certainly stands there, and it has stood there for thousands of years. And for people who are interested in probing that, if you come to us, you want to have this kind of information, then please raise that along with other questions that you would like to have answered. But I'm going to say this, and Dennis said this earlier, put your face in a book, not a book, many books. You can't, there's never a point at which you know everything, but you will know more tomorrow than you know today. And goodness knows you will know more today than what you knew yesterday. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for saying.
We seem to be having, we might have lost Muriel. Her,
And congratulate you on your success in New Jersey.
we seem to have lost Muriel, which is very sad. But Dennis, thank you so, so very much for this. This was incredible. We are going to post the video. We already have many requests for your video. We are going to post the video next week. We should have it on our website and our YouTube channel. I did post a link on the chat. If you missed that, just visit our website. It's bsec.org, bsec.org, and we will feature the video on our homepage starting next week. I also posted links on the chat for you to, if you're interested in next week's program about the critical race theory, as well as a link for you to sign up for a newsletter so you can get to know all of the programs that we're having, and come see us again. I'm going to say
Blessings,
goodnight.
family. Thank you so much for having me. Take care, everybody. Much love.
Thank
Thank you. Awesome, awesome presentation. Thank you.
Oh, I'd love to you too.
And everybody have a good night.